challenging things, and I guess it's a skill that we have to have as mediators, is we need to be able to deal with what we may consider to be difficult people. And I remember when I first started studying this many years ago, we thought of difficult people really as being anybody who displayed any sort of feelings or emotion or dissatisfaction to what the experience that they've had. And I remember once talking to a mentor of mine going back many years, and he talked to me and he would say to me, a lot of how we deal with difficult people, and I struggle to use that term these days, is because I prefer to call them difficult people situations. But one of the things he would say is how we really set our minds. It's the mindset that we have. And one of the things that he always said to me was, rather than seeing people as being difficult, we should see them as being emotional. Because when people are emotional, they can display behaviours, traits of being difficult to us, but it's just purely them trying to forcibly perhaps get their point of view across. And so when we start thinking about some of these difficult situations, perhaps what we need to start thinking about is, how are their behaviours, how are our behaviours impacted by things like how we feel? And just to give you one example of this, one of the arguments that's often put forward based on various studies is that when it comes to listening, we listen on up to 6 different levels. We tune in, we listen on up to 6 different levels. And I remember when I first read reports on this, the thing that really stuck in my mind was one particular report that first of all explained the 2 extremes. One extreme was what they called passive listening. And passive listening is basically where you're not really listening to a single word, but you're keeping eye contact, perhaps nodding your head. The type of behaviours you would display after a long trip home after work, and when you get indoors and you say to your partner, how was your day today? You know, do you really want to know? Do you really engage in what they're saying to you, or are you more concerned about your own feelings and comforts? The other extreme that this report talked about was what they called active listening. And active listening is where you're really tuned in to what's being said to you because it's interesting, it's stimulating, it's information you need to know, perhaps even your life depends on it. And a lot of us will display physiological reactions. We will have heightened senses when we are in active listening mode. Now, if you can appreciate those 2 extremes, then chances are you will agree with me, you're not just in one extreme or the other, you could be anywhere between those 2 extremes. And this is what we call the range of listening. And if you think about one question, and that is, when somebody is emotional, are they more likely to be in passive listening mode or active listening mode? In other words, are they more interested in what you're saying to them, or more interested in getting their point of view across to you? And I think that most of us would agree, if not all of us, that people will be in passive listening mode. In other words, they're interested in getting their own points of view across and not listening to you. And this is, of course, sometimes when we have to explain something 2 or 3 times because people aren't taking it in. So if we think about that and some other things that we would explore on various training sessions, I suppose what we need to think about is, can we have a logical discussion with somebody who's emotional? And I think the answer is clearly not. So, as my mentor once said to me, the art of dealing with difficult people situations, or as he said, emotional people, is asking ourselves the question, how do we calm the person down so that rather than being emotional, they're much more rational? And of course, again, we could brainstorm these points. I'm sure if I brainstorm them now, many of you would be thinking about things, well, let's listen to the person, let's not interrupt them, let's try and allow them to vent, get some of this emotion out of their system. I'm sure many of you are thinking at this moment in time, we need to show empathy. And of course, empathy isn't necessarily agreeing with the other person, but it's at least recognising that they can have their point of view. They have a right to have that point of view. We need to probably take ownership for explaining the true facts of the situation. And if you think about those initial ideas, thinking about somebody who's just being emotional, they're not being disrespectful to you, if we listen to what they say to us, if we avoid interrupting them, if we show some kind of empathy, what we can help do is we can help calm the emotion down so that then we can start having a rational discussion. And I think the best way this was explained to me some years ago was by a trainer on a session. And the trainer, who was a colleague of mine on a training course, always used to ask the question, what does an emotional customer and a newly poured pint of Guinness have in common? And I'm sure we could relate this story to many things, but what he used to say is, you can't do a thing with either of them until you let the head settle. And of course, with a pint of Guinness, particularly if it was newly poured, you put it on the side and wait up to 3 minutes, depending on where you were in the world. But with an emotional person, what we have to do is calm the emotions down